Everyone, hello. Welcome to today's webinar. Some of you know who I am, but some of you don't. My name is Alvaro Mendez, and I'm the director of the LSE Global South Unit. And it is really a pleasure to be with you today. I'm not in the Global South at the moment. I'm talking to you from London, but it's a great pleasure to have you in this particular event. What we do is we investigate the role of the Global South in IR, in international relations, and we've been doing that for decades. In fact, as part of that research agenda, I have had the pleasure to meet Daniel and to work with Enrique as well, both of them from Latin America, as they will tell you in a few minutes. Our main research focuses on China and the Global South. On that note, we have a teaching program. I co-direct the unit with Professor Chris Alden, also here from the LSE. And we have actually a course called China and the Global South, which is actually unique. And we teach that course here at LSE, also at Sciences Po, Paris. And I used to teach the same course at the University of Beijing, Peking University. But we haven't been able to go back to China. But I will be starting to teach the course again at Fudan University, hopefully from this summer. We focus on different areas, but mainly on China and Africa, and China and Latin America. We also conduct research on sustainability issues around these particular themes. As part of our research, we publish quite a bit. My colleague, Li Wen, is going to send you some links for you to see our publications. We have a working paper series, and I'm delighted to tell you that today of all days, and we didn't plan this, our new book with Chris Holden has come out on China and Latin America, published by Bloomsbury. So a link is there for you as well. Not doing publicity for you to buy the book, simply take a look and see if it is something that may interest you. So I'm very excited about this. We also publish a working paper series, and in fact, today's webinar is connected with that because Daniel was one of the authors of a recent working paper called The Andean Community in the Middle of the Trade War, which a lot of people have read with a lot of interest, and of course very relevant to what we're doing today. I'd like to thank Li Wen NG, who is the Research Engagement Officer, who facilitated this process, and I'm very grateful to you, Li Wen, for organizing this webinar. Please be advised that we are going to be recording this meeting. The only people who will be in the video, which will be uploaded to YouTube, are going to be the speakers. So no one else here in the room in the little windows will be part of that. But you can also follow it in YouTube, and we will let you know. We have a Twitter account, which Li Wen will share with you. And we also have links to our website and also the other activities. Our center is based also within LSE Ideas, another center of foreign policy issues here at the LSE. Anyway, without further ado, I want to tell you how the seminar is going to be divided. First of all, we will have a presentation, then a discussion, then we will have the opportunity for questions from you, and I hope you have some interesting ones. It is my pleasure to welcome the speaker, Daniel Agramont, who is a research fellow at the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. He will speak for approximately 25 minutes, as I said before. And our discussant, my good friend and colleague, Enrique Garcia, who's the former president of CAF, one of the most important regional banks in Latin America, and who is now a visiting professor in practice here at the London School of Economics. Daniel, Enrique, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you. And please, Daniel, go ahead.
Enrique, it's a pleasure to see you again through the screen. Thank you for the invitation. And I was so happy to publish this research with the Global South Unit. And yes, I got into this topic, China, like 6 years ago, I guess, with the work with Alvaro and Chris here in Bolivia. And then I got to continue that in Germany. And now this specific paper is a quantitative assessment, not trying to understand this decoupling or measure the decoupling, but trying to figure out the impact that this is going to have in the Global South, specifically the Andean Community. So through a specific methodology, trying to analyze trade data, I have found that there are quite some possibilities, even though the relation, as I will show you, the first part of the research, the relation is a typical center periphery one, but still, then we'll find that there are opportunities beyond minerals and hydrocarbons, and that is the main interest of the paper. So let me share my screen so can use my presentation. Okay, if you all can see my presentation, it's about the China-US economic war, but trying to find out the opportunities for the Andean community beyond this decoupling process. First, so we will talk a bit about this great power competition and decoupling. We're talking about China and the huge economic growth that had, and this rise, which started in 1979, but then the WTO accession in 2001 is also milestone, and China's rise as a great power in the international system in the 21st century is happening at a turbulent time. Emerging economies are acquiring more presence and power, and this is accompanied by a decreasing relative power of Western powers, mainly the US. Of course, we're not talking about a total decline of the West, but their power is growingly contested by these rising emerging markets. So our interest is following Branko Milanovic and other authors to understand how these will impact the peripheries. Of course, we know that there's a huge impact. We see it every day on the news. Everything that China and the US do in this economic competition is having impact. And in this case, the question is, can the peripheries benefit of this? I mean, the previous hegemonic competition by the beginning of the 20th century and this decline of Great Britain, this peaceful decline and rise of the US, for Latin America, for South America specifically, didn't have much changes. We deepened this dependence on natural resources, maybe not changing from selling to Spain, to Great Britain, to European powers, more to the US, but that was it. So now in a post-COVID pandemic, like Garcia and Mendez analyzed, is a particular important moment for Latin America in which we can try to overcome the huge impact of this economic slowdown and trying to look further beyond natural resources. So there are a lot of names like the trade war, the tech war, decoupling, and that's what we will try to explain in this slide. Great power competition makes reference nowadays to this competition between China, the rising hegemon, and the US, the current, or maybe even the declining hegemon, depending on what we measure. But China, it's fair to say that it is now the contending hegemon after this growth miracle. The openness and the industrialization cannot be understated. China has become the factory of the world. China can produce all the industrial goods in the industrial classification of the United Nations, for example. China can produce low, medium, and even now high-tech goods. But China is facing now crossroads. This is no secret. Chinese economy has to be rebalanced because growth was slowing down, even after the COVID pandemic. The rebalancing, trying to look inwards, not only promoting exports and FDI, trying to promote the internal market. In some, the Chinese Communist Party knows that the Chinese economy is facing this slowdown, and they have already begun to implement several measures, included in a lot of plans, public plans that we can access, to become the world leading manufacturer. China wants to achieve technological supremacy, not only low or medium goods, but also high tech, which includes the production of their own intellectual property, technological supremacy. And this has caused a response by the US. So this great power competition, which can more clearly be dated to 2017 with a strategic change in US policy, now is making relations between both really complicated economic relations. Some say that this decoupling is growing slow. Others see that there are a lot of indicators that say that specific areas like high-tech goods and semiconductors, 5G, are the perfect example of this decoupling. But what we see is that there is a clear change of policy between both. So maybe the tension is rising, declining, but policies have changed. Both are seeing each other as competitors. China arguing that the US is the one who implements more measures to stop Chinese trade or Chinese technology. But the truth is that we see that now this term tech war will one day describe what we are living as the Cold War of our times. Before the Russian attack to Ukraine, we were talking about a technological war is our Cold War. There is no possibility or low possibility of military conflict, violence. Now we're not so sure, okay? But the economic war is happening. So China is challenging the United States for supremacy. And this supremacy is in the field of technology. And of course, this involves economic flows. So if the US wants to stop China's rise, China's technological supremacy, will implement more and more barriers to stop Chinese trade, Chinese investment, to stop Chinese technology production. And in turn, China has shown that they will answer quite as hard. So this is what we say economic decoupling. This is what we call economic decoupling, the process resulting from the trade and the technological war, which impacts flows. So this globalization, liberal globalization, with rising economic flows, efficiency as the main driver, is no longer valid. Of course, we still don't know how quick this will evolve, but it's already happening. And this is the departure for the analysis. If China will if US will buy less from China, and in response, China will buy less from the US, there are possibilities for other countries to participate in this trade. These global value chains, which gave little space to South America, now we see a window of opportunity, talking about regional value chains, talking about the cup opportunity for participating in these value chains. So now let's talk about the Andean community. Okay, yes, I have 15 minutes. Good. Let's talk a bit about the Andean community. It wouldn't be fair to say that the US or China are the hegemons or are exploiting our imperial powers, and everything that happens in South America or the Andean community is their fault. No, first let's analyze the productive structure. And as we can see in these graphs, which I took from the Atlas of Economic Complexity of the MIT, the main conclusion is that we have economies that depend on natural resources at a high degree. We are extractivist. Extractivism, as we call it in Southern academia, extractivism is the main problem. Like we say here in Bolivian academic forums, we know the enemy. Extractivism, we know it. Of course, the main question is how can we overcome it? But in the case of Bolivia, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, we see that tourism, services, this purple is small, rather small, and that we depend on hydrocarbons and minerals. In the case of Bolivia, gas, then zinc, or gold growing. In the case of Colombia, petroleum oils, coal, oil, and then agricultural goods like coffee, flowers. In the case of Peru, copper, zinc, petroleum, gold, and some agricultural goods, mainly the fishing industry. Then Ecuador, bananas and petroleum representing 32%. Then bananas, crustaceans, fishes, and these other colors, which represent more complex goods, which are a really good measure of added value. We can say that the economic complexity in our countries is really low. Most of our exports are of low complexity, that is low added value. And now if we analyze the Andean community straight with China and the US, we can say it's a typical center-periphery relation. First, here on the left, follow me here on the left. On the upper side, we have China exports to CAN and then Chinese imports from CAN. In Chinese exports to CAN, we see that China exports all kinds of goods. Not only the low tech goods, low added value goods from the 90s, from the beginning of the 2000s. No, nowadays China sells high tech, medium tech, and also low tech goods. But even the relation is 50-50. Like 50% of Chinese exports to CAN are medium and high tech goods. And on the contrary, imports are mainly natural resources, primary products, the green area, and resource-based manufacture. But all in all, it's natural resources. This blue area, resource-based, is are minerals or petroleum that underwent only a bit of a transformation process. Also, you can see the size of the area. Yes. The trade is highly skewed in favor to China. Then US exports to the Andean community, see the same, but high-tech goods are smaller than medium tech, okay? And most of US exports to CAN are medium and resource-based manufacture. And the imports, okay, is primary products and resource-based. For both contending powers, we can say that we sell natural resources, and on the contrary, we buy all kinds of manufacture. Just one important fact is that trade with the US, nevertheless, is more balanced than China. That is, the US buys more manufacture from the Andean community than China. China barely buys any manufacture, and this is one idea that we will develop. So, do we have dependency on the US? These are the main exports at 4-digit level, main exports of CAN to the US. And we see that we export petroleum crude, okay, 35% of all trade, petroleum oils excluding crude, 11, flowers 6%, coffee 5%, gold 4%, bananas 3%, and so on. And these two columns give us the dependency. We can say that CAN is more dependent on the US than the US on CAN. We know that the US is the world's largest economy, the leading hegemon. Yes, but even then, we can say that we have some strong products as Andean community. Like what? US depends 97% on flowers coming from the Andean community, 24% on bananas, 19% of grapes. On the contrary, we depend more on the US market on several goods. Of course, these are not industrial goods, natural resources, and agriculture, but there are some strengths. And in the case of China, we export copper concentrates, petroleum, crustaceans, flowers, copper, iron ores. And again, taking a look at the dependencies, main conclusion, we are highly dependent on China, and China not so much on CAN. But still, we see some interesting cases, like 51% of flour and meals of fish that China buys from the world come from CAN, 24% of copper, 30% of crustaceans and fishes, 25% of zinc. No, we don't have time for country analysis. I will go directly to the opportunities. So in talking about the opportunities beyond natural resources, because as we see, we mostly sell petroleum, minerals, and agricultural goods like flowers, coffee, and then fishes, crustaceans. We try to find the export opportunities. The methodology is quite simple. The analysis will be based on existing exports. We don't want to analyze future scenarios. It's something we can do even with the methodology of the economic complexity atlas, something for the future. And an opportunity will be arced to have been found if a product is currently being exported by any Andean country to the world. Okay, exports exist, and if at the same time it has considerable trade flows between China and the US. So if we meet these two conditions, we can say that we have an opportunity to replace trade because of the decoupling process. The analysis was conducted separately, and the threshold was established at a minimum of 5% for Andean exports. And also, it has to be noted that we didn't take into account any opportunity in hydrocarbons or minerals, because that's what we already do. That we know how to do that. We have 200 or maybe 100 to 500 years of experience doing this. So these opportunities were tried to be found in added value sectors, or in this Atlas complexity language, in more complex sectors. So export opportunities in China. We have found a total of 82 opportunities at a 4-digit level. So that's quite high. Bolivia 12, Ecuador 20, Peru 8, Colombia 42. And this represented total of exports for the Andean countries: 8% of Bolivia, 26% of Ecuador, 8% of Peru, 40% of Colombia. So these are quite high volumes. And we see that also in China, they have a huge market. For example, we have found 4 billion in opportunities for Colombia. And we also see that for this exact product, the opportunities in the current trade in China is 10 billion. So in total, these opportunities would represent for the Andean community 13 billion. And the potential market in China is 19 billion. So it's quite high. But also note the average tariff also is high, talking about a world in which tariffs for manufactured goods are close to zero. In this case, we see that there are considerable tariffs, and Peru is the only country that has signed a free trade agreement with China. So in this case, we can say this most favored nation tariff would be zero, but the other ones would be facing this tariff. And in the US, in total for the Andean community, we have 78 opportunities. This would represent 9 billion exports. And the potential market in the US is 71 billion. So in this case, the potential market is larger than in China. In both cases are more than double. So we can say that if China stops buying some products from the US and the US stops buying from China, we have a huge market in those nations. And we also have already the production, the potential export. In the case of Bolivia, for the US would be 8 opportunities, in Ecuador 24, or 9. Again, Colombia 40. So the one who has more opportunities, both in China and the US, is Colombia. There's no casualty. We know that Colombia is the one with the most advanced industrial base of the 4 Andean nations. So while Bolivia maybe would have huge opportunities for minerals, or Ecuador for fishes, we're trying to find opportunities beyond natural resources. So in this case, for example, Bolivia will have opportunities to the US, which represent 4% of its total exports. But for Ecuador would be 15, for Colombia 14. Quite interesting. And also they face these average tariffs in the US market. But we can say that for Peru and Colombia, this would be zero. So they would not have to compete in unequal conditions with other southern nations that already reach the US, like Mexico, the huge Mexican trade. So it will be zero. But in the case of Bolivia and Ecuador, they will face these tariffs, which puts them in a less advantaged position. Okay, I have 3 minutes, so I can move on to the conclusions. First, we found that can trade with both the US and China follow a typical center-periphery type. Then, while China and the US are among the most important trade partners for the Andean community, can barely represents 1% of their trade flows. Okay, this is important. Why? Because we know that we are small economies, and we know that we sell mostly natural resources. But still, there is the notion that, okay, China and the US, even though they are huge industrial powers, they need minerals. So maybe we can have some leverage on them because they need our minerals. Well, we have seen in this analysis of dependency that we don't have that much leverage. The only one is Peru. The only one is Peru with copper. And Bolivia, just a bit with zinc and molybdenum, these specific minerals to the US. But in general, we can say that China and the US buy natural resources from so many southern nations that we don't have that much leverage. Still, it's important that trade with the US is more balanced than with China. China doesn't buy manufacture from us or some agricultural goods, mostly minerals and petroleum. Then another conclusion is that still some specific products were found in which other nations have a strong position. For the US, for example, we have a strong position in what? In consumption goods like flowers, coffee, we said, fishes. There is not a geopolitical importance in that, but also we have found important inputs for industry in which the US depends on the Andean community, like tungsten and aluminum coming from Bolivia, tin a little lower. China, only Peru is among the 5 most important providers of several goods. So while the other Andean nations have trade with China, and China is the first or second partner for Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, only Peru has a strong position into goods, copper goods. Finally, regarding the opportunities, we have found 82 products that can benefit from this economic war between China and the US. For can, which represent 13 billion and have a potential market of 90. In the case of the US, we have found 78 products can benefit, for which can has already exported 9.4 billion as an average of 2015-19. And this has a potential market in the US of 71 billion. So as a main conclusion to close my presentation, we don't know how this decoupling or this trade war, tech war is going to evolve. But for what we have already seen and for what we know in the news and the struggle for 5G and semiconductors, my opinion is that we can expect a growing decoupling between those nations. Of course, private companies don't want to do that, but we can expect tougher policies from governments. Private companies are not following the rhetoric, that's true. Since 2017, since Donald Trump inaugurated this new stage with China, trade flows, investment flows didn't fall as politicians expected. But what we can expect is the political discourse getting tougher, and this will translate in specific barriers. So this is something that we can benefit as peripheries, as Andean community, with both nations.
no more.
Perfect.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Daniel, this is a very good presentation. And of course, the more specific we are on specific cases by countries, I mean, the better in order to understand how they relate to China and the US as well. And I think the message is that not all roads lead to Beijing or Washington. That should be the message, I think. Enrique and I have written on this quite a bit on value creation in Latin America, and I'll be happy to share with you the journal article that we published in 2021. But I'm going to give the opportunity to Enrique to discuss the findings and to give us his own views as well. Enrique, very good to see you. Welcome to the webinar.
Okay. I see you are younger, less hair, but good beard. You know, that's good. Huh? And Daniel has a very nice hair now. So good to see all of you. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Alvaro. It's always a pleasure to work with the great institution that is LSE. And Daniel, to see you again. I certainly congratulate you for an excellent presentation. It's very concrete. It puts issues that are so relevant for the Andean countries. But I think I agree with most of the things that you have said. I would like to put my comments in a more general context. To the main message is that if Latin America as a whole, and of course the Andean countries in particular, want to really move in the right direction, they have to work very hard in building up a renewed development agenda that is consistent with the realities of this new era. The fourth industrial revolution, the tensions that occurred that you have described so well between China and the United States, and the importance that I agree with Alvaro. We precisely wrote an article about a year ago on the importance of this decoupling and the possibilities for Latin America, South America in particular, to join efforts to insert the region in the value chains, in production chains, in trade chains. But to do that, it's very important to have the right strategies. And one of the concerns that I start pointing out now, that the overall political situation, institutional situation in Latin America in general, and particularly in the Andean region, is not precisely the best. We are looking at very tense situations in several countries. We see what's happening in Peru, what's happening in Bolivia, what's happening in Ecuador, and going beyond what we have seen in Brazil, we see in Chile. So I don't see that governments at this time are focusing on this relevant issue, is how to have a strategy that will tackle the real issues. And perhaps it's good to mention something that I've been repeating all the time, that unfortunately our region, when I mean our region, I'm talking about Latin America, has lost relative importance. Remember, of course, you guys are too young, but in the early 60s, we as a region were the region of the future. Brazil was the developing country of the future. And just to illustrate, if we compare to other regions with the emerging countries in Asia, just for instance, take GDP per capita. South Korea, had a GDP per capita that was 1/4 of that of Latin America in 1966, 50s. We had a participation that was above 12% of trade. Today it's 5-6%. And all the indicators. And of course, if we take also specifically GDP per capita and all the other issues, we are behind. And perhaps it's good to mention that some other indicators, the rate of growth that we have had been volatile, precisely for the reasons that you have mentioned, Daniel, in terms that our high dependence on commodities, which are highly dependent on on prices. And we see in the boom areas, we're very happy. Oh, well, I remember very well. I have been in my decades of service in most of the summits. And I remember in the year 2004, in the early part of this millennium, that in the summits, all the presidents at that time, right and left, were saying, "Oh, Latin America is flying. We are in the process of it." And there were two persons who were presidents, but not presidents of countries. There was one Enrique, the good Enrique and the bad Enrique. Good Enrique Iglesias, he was president of the IDB, and bad Enrique, myself, president of CAP. And we told them, be careful. Let's not be so enthusiastic. We are behind in many, many things. And it's a fact. And for instance, I put one indicator, which is very important, the so-called competitiveness 4.0, that was developed by the World Economic Forum, which has 12 pillars, which include macroeconomic stability, includes issues of institutions, it includes infrastructure, information technology, innovation, health, skills, education, law, all this. And 142 countries. Of course, in the last 2 years, they were not able to do that because of the pandemic. But the last one, out of 142 countries, there were only 2 countries that were below 50, which was Chile 33 and in Mexico 48. In the Andean, the 2 best were Colombia and Peru, but both were below 70. There were some, I don't want to unfortunately mention my country, Ecuador, were above 90, and in Bolivia above 100. And of course, that shows us how the challenging situation that we have in the future. So my concern, my main concern is, how do we put in the agenda of the governments, and not only of the governments, of the political players of society, the importance of a long-term strategy? When one compares what has happened in the Asian countries, in Korea, in China, they had a long-term approach. And very interesting what Daniel was mentioning, the movement of China, the way to be a superpower, and part of that, it's very interesting, was in the post-Mao era, very early. What happened? China had a very smart, intelligent policy to attract direct foreign investment. And I was telling one of the presidents of my country, I was telling them, we are in Congress, I was telling President Evo Morales, I said, why is that you are so hesitant in foreign investment? No, because they take the natural resource. I said, look, you know which country in the world is the most successful one in using and attracting direct investment? No, he said, well, China. And in fact, who and which countries are the main investors in China? Number 1, United States. Number 2, European Union. And then Australia. And what type of direct investment? Technology. And as Daniel has explained, there is a change in the approach of China because of the tension and so forth. And in fact, I was in China. I was a visiting professor at Normal University. And before the pandemic, in a meeting when they were coming with a new plan, they were precisely mentioning this matter to try to have more technological development coming from inside. And that's one of the targets. Unfortunately, the situation in the last 2 years has not been favorable for many reasons. As we can see, China, after growing at 10, 11%, 8% is growing at 3%. And there are other issues. But there is no doubt that this is a powerhouse. And a general message that I always give, we have to be very pragmatic in Latin America. We have to play the game in terms of having a balanced relationship with the United States and with China. Let's not try to be fanatics on one side or the other, because as well shown, the opportunities are open in both sides. But for this purpose, it is important to have this long-term strategy and to do some critical things, because we cannot continue to have this export concentration, the low inter-regional trade. It's, if you compare 17%, 16% inter-regional trade in Latin America compared to close to 40% in Asia, over 60% in Europe. The low savings, and sometimes we don't think about that, low savings capacity of the region. The savings ratio, in other words, what is saved by governments, by private and public firms, and by households, on average is about 18%. Before the pandemic, in recent years, some of the countries are with 13 or 14% of savings. To have a reasonable rate of growth that will permit to really do the other things, you need to invest at least 25, 26%. Well, how are you going to do that? You have to have access to international funds. The multilaterals are very crucial, but that's not sufficient. Multilaterals are good in providing some resources, technical know-how, and a catalytic role that opens the possibility of capital markets, direct investment, and others to go, bilateral lenders. Why? Because they offer the assurances that the studies on the projects and initiatives that are going to be undertaken have comprehensive feasibility studies, which include economic, social, environmental considerations, institutional considerations, and definitely one thing, transparency in the process of procurement, the acquisition of goods and services, consultants, and so forth. So this is a very, very crucial element. Things that we have to emphasize, that's the case of Latin America, and for Peru, of Ecuador, of Bolivia, and Colombia, is first, you have to restore macroeconomic stability. I think the Andean countries have been good pupils in recent times. We don't have the hyperinflations, well, the former Andean country, which is Venezuela, or what's happening in Argentina. We have Peru, we have Bolivia, with good macroeconomic management. But that's not sufficient. You have to move to the second thing, efficiency, which means productivity, competitiveness, creation of employment. That's not sufficient. You have to create skills, education for this new era. And that's not sufficient. You have to think about a better distribution of income, because unfortunately, our Latin America and some of the countries in the Andean region are not the best examples of very poor distribution of income. The average Gini in Latin America is 0.47, and unfortunately, most of our countries are above 40. And unfortunately, Colombia is 54. So these are issues that have to be tackled. And definitely, one strong position I have, is the importance of regional integration and cooperation in a pragmatic and not ideological way. If you look what has happened, I have lived with my career more than 50 years, very linked to the creation of the Andean Community, to Mercosur, the initial efforts of UNASUR, which have been changed completely. The initial meeting in which CELAC was created. If you have been watching what has happened in CELAC 2 days ago, that's not the way things should be, fighting, talking about ideology. No, we need to have a definite way to. So I believe that what Daniel is proposing is, I think, a very, very good guideline. But now we have to emphasize on institutions, democratic institutions, respect of law, which unfortunately, I'm frank and open. We are in a very terrible situation in most of the countries. And without that institutional building, without the understanding between governments and opposition, between understanding and civil society, they need to work together. I'm sorry to tell you, we are not going to have a good future. So your comments, your excellent presentation, Daniel, I think is an input that for all of us to continue exploring things. And I think that at LSE, we should go forward in looking at things in the South and how we relate to the superpowers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Enrique and Daniel, for this provoking conversation. One of the things that, food for thought for the future, we keep talking about ourselves in Latin America very often. One of the good things that we do at the Global South is that we sort of compare other Global South countries with our situation. So it might be a good idea to identify other countries outside Latin America with the same issues, because I'm pretty sure there are plenty, especially in relation to China and the US, to see what lessons can be learned in terms of this. Having said that, I have a couple of questions. Some questions have come up from colleagues as well. But the first question, Daniel, is you wrote this paper a while ago. Things have changed, of course, and politically as well. And we are about to get a new FTA signed. It has been approved. I think it's a matter of time for Ecuador. It will be the fourth FTA with China. Do you think that will have an impact? You talk about a lot about Peru. Of course, they're very different issues in these two different countries and obviously in the region.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you, Professor Enrique Garcia. So accurate comments about not only extractivism, but looking beyond industrial policy as the solution to extractivism, only industrial policy. We know we have tried that from the left, from the right, from the center, from statism, liberalism, and that was not the answer. And regarding this specific question, yes, in the case of Ecuador, is really interesting because Ecuador is, Ecuador was motivated to sign this FTA with the European Union. I was part of the negotiation team in 2008 with Andean Community with the European Union, and Bolivia and Ecuador quit it. But after some years, all quiet, Rafael Correa signed it because of shrimps and bananas. Ecuador couldn't say no to the European Union, highly dependent. Now with China, we see it's trade, well, a little bit of petroleum, doesn't need the FTA. But for these goods, I think this opens a great window of opportunities. Processed food, processed fish, food, like flowers, but all this array of goods that Ecuador now have to sell, they have already the production. And fruits and fishery, all agricultural goods with a process of transformation. This is a great window for China. And I think this is what motivated them. And of course, in the data, we have seen that the Ecuadorian share in China is low. So this means that it has a lot of competition from other southern nations. In this case, this will be a huge advantage for Ecuadorian products. It's a huge debate, Alvaro, about FTA. Which FTA is this? Chinese FTA is not the same as the US FTA. So in this case, well, taking into account that this was consensual, it didn't have all the opposition that we had during the 90s in the Andean nations. El TLC es muerte, no al TLC, no a la OMC. In this case, the Chinese FTA was signed with all this huge social fracture. So I think it's a good deal for Ecuador because we are still going to buy all kinds of Chinese goods anyway. In this case, the analysis, the general equilibrium analysis, a mathematical economical analysis is not valid because we still buy everything they sell. For example, furniture in Bolivia was it had a huge impact from China. In the case of Ecuador, maybe it's worth to analyze the sensitive products that should be protected, subsidized in this interim. I don't know, but all in all, those are great news. For in the Bolivian case or the Colombian case, this FTA for Colombia would bring a lot of opportunities. In the case of Bolivia, not so much for what we have seen in the paper, and also just the name FTA for Bolivia still will not be possible. No way.
Just to clarify, the last time I checked, it hasn't been signed. It's been, I mean, the negotiation has concluded, and now they're supposed to go into legislative approval. But, you know, I can tell you that this is going to go through because the political agenda is there. And of course, you're absolutely right. This is not the same as an FTA with the US that has to go under a lot of scrutiny. These negotiations took 11 months. And 5 rounds. And if you compare that to the US, you know, that has to go through legislative approval on the US side. And obviously this is very different. And China has a mandate of getting FTAs. It's not, we shouldn't feel unique because China tells us they want an FTA. This is something that they want to do with a lot of countries in the same way they want countries to endorse the BRI. So I think that that's a very fair point. I don't know if Enrique has anything to say to this respect.
No, I think I agree.
One of the things that your paper puts forward is how to find opportunities, Daniel. And I think Enrique and I have done the same. And of course, we're the three of us are academics. Enrique has more experience in policymaking. How about nearshoring, which is an idea that comes up a lot on decoupling, and US policymakers love the idea. People talk about it. How can we take advantage of this nearshoring in Latin America?
You know, talking about Latin America, we have Mexico. The first thing to take into account is Mexico. So in this nearshoring, well, the Mexico, they're really happy about the decoupling. They're the ones who will benefit the most. But now, as a region, first we will have to say how can we compete with Mexico? In this case, with everything they have to sell to the US. So one of these proposals, and now that we have had the CELAC reunion 2 days ago, this is my biggest question. Can we still think as a region? Do we have political space maneuver for thinking as a region? In this book, I read about the non-alignment, in this active non-alignment in the 21st century. And I'm quite skeptical, because we have a lot of integration processes, and now they're trying. I'm so happy that they didn't create a new one, okay? But now that CELAC had this reunion, I'm still skeptical that we can have a common voice. So in this case, it really be that we have to compete with all the others, with Brazil, with Mexico for this nearshoring. If we sign something with the US, we are in a better position. If we don't sign, well, maybe as a region, we can have an anonymous voice for this, but this will depend how this evolves. Now, all eyes are on Lula, you know, but I'm quite skeptical that we can agree with Mexico and Brazil for this, and they are the ones who are going to benefit the most.
And just to add, I mean, I would say that Mexico might not be necessarily the best example. They do benefit from the impact from the US on producing and putting together cars and so on. Enrique?
No, I see that if our countries, the medium-sized countries, make the integration schemes work again, like it was happening 25 years ago. In other words, cooperation that will permit to establish this cooperation on the productive side, to try to have chains of production, not only trade, but production, that will stimulate also small and medium-sized enterprises. So working Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, and try to insert in the world. And that's possible, but it requires a strategy. Definitely Mexico has the advantage of being very close, but you know, the relationship of Mexico with the United States, as we put in our article with Alvaro, has been based on the more traditional approach, which is labor-intensive, automotive things. And the Costa Rica did a very interesting thing because it inserted technology, but not only the factory, but the smart thing, the technology that now goes to China. So we have to work very hard. There is no doubt. But again, my point is, all these things can only happen if there is the willingness of the leaders to have a dialogue, to have the participation of the private sector, of civil society, to understand a long-term strategy. I think one of the great mistakes of our region is that every time you have a new president, the first thing they say is, today history starts. That's not true. And they concentrate and criticize in the previous government and offer things that are impossible to do. And 3 years later or 4 years later, the same thing happens. Even the ministers change and they come with new theories. How can we do what the Asians have done? No, of course, the challenge is they don't have democratic governments. How can we do that in a democratic system, which I strongly believe in?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, it's a challenge that we have. And everyone thinks that they're inventing the wheel or reinventing the wheel. And in reality, this is not the case. I want to thank you both for your participation in today's webinar. I love these discussions, especially we are having the opportunity here to talk about academic matters into more policymaking, how to convert that into more policymaking ideas. So thank you, Enrique. Thank you, Daniel. I have shared links of the paper with our colleagues here as well. And just to tell you that we have several webinars coming up. The next one is on Chinese mining in Ghana. I think it's very important to look at the Global South as a whole, not just one region. And that will be on April the 20th at 2 p.m. Please follow us on Twitter as well. So thank you, everyone, for your participation. And I will see you very soon. Have a good
Thank you, Daniel.
afternoon.
It was a pleasure. And Alvaro, thank you very much. We'll be in
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.